Welcome to the Kasna Anthos webinar. Great to have you with us today. I'm CEO Simon Poulton.
And I'm CTO Troy Beebe.
So today, as expected from the title, we're going to be exploring Anthos. I think there's been a fair bit of content produced around Anthos. One of the things I guess we've found though is a lot of that's kind of theoretical or hypothetical. And what we wanted to do was create some practical use cases which would demonstrate how organizations might be able to take advantage of Anthos. So just before we drill into that, some of the statistics I think are worth exploring around this. 9 out of 10 organizations are actually operating already in a multi or hybrid cloud scenario. And I think, in fact, probably all the people that would watch this would probably be in the same situation. But the important counterpoint is that 75% of organizations actually, or of applications, are still on-premise and legacy. So one of the things that we're looking at today is how to affect that statistic. But the other important thing, which I think is a couple of aspirational stats, is that 87% of orgs either are running or want to run containerized workloads, not perhaps for all of their applications, but certainly for the business valuable ones. And then 59% of people actually, a majority of people don't want to just lift and shift to the cloud. They actually want to extract better value from the cloud via modernization.
Mm-hmm.
So all quite important stats, especially when taken in light of the next slide, which is a bit more of a journey map of how to get there. And I think we've covered this slide before on our vlog Between Two Clouds. But just to reiterate here, what you're looking at, the bottom left corner is really describing that 75% of workloads, which is legacy on-prem. And then, the top right corner is talking about that kind of aspirational cloud native type environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're finding with a lot of our customers that just migrating to the cloud is expensive and doesn't get them the same value as modernizing. And so we're finding many are looking at modernizing in place in their on-prem and then moving into cloud and taking advantage of cloud native technologies once they've modernized.
Yeah, perfect. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the other thing on this slide is that you can see where a lot of people might have lifted and shifted already and might have that investment in AWS or Azure already. We're going to talk a little bit about that today as well.
And it's quite expensive to just move from on-prem direct to cloud without any changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what are we talking about today? Well, Anthos really has kind of 3 key abilities, and the first one is really that modernize in place. So how do we actually equip teams with the right technology that they can have that kind of cloud native experience of containerization, not just the technology itself, but also develop the practices that are required to be able to leverage containers well. The second thing is really automating policy at scale. So one of the challenges, I guess, around how secure you are in the cloud relates to how you apply policy and controls. So what Anthos allows you to do, I guess, is to actually do that policy control at scale. Mm-hmm. And we'll certainly be unpacking that a bit from a practical perspective. And the last thing, I guess, is consistency. So whether you're running on a given cloud, like any vendor's cloud, or running on-prem, actually get some consistency in everything from how you develop to how you apply those controls.
Yep.
Yep. So just talking a little bit about what Anthos stitches together, as I was just saying in the last slide, really, whatever your cloud vendor, whether that's AWS, Azure, or Google, or whether it's on-prem, Anthos will allow you to kind of manage workloads.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So just to start on a little bit of background about where we are and how where this whole Anthos journey sort of came from. I guess we'll start with a bit of background about Google's been running containerized workloads for 15 years. And in 2006, they started working on C groups, which is a Linux container flavor for the Linux operating system, and contributed that to mainline in 2008. There's a great set of zines from Julia Evans. I encourage everybody to have a look at that. It talks a lot about the technical changes that were implemented in Linux and what Google's been doing for 15 years with containers and the technology behind that drove containerization.
Right.
And next, what came along was Docker, which was a set of tooling that really saw an explosion in microservices, and that decoupled your business logic, allowed you to evolve your features much faster, segment development teams. And so that was a huge shift. And when you're comparing with VMs, which most people have on their on-prem and ESX legacy infrastructure, there's big differences between containerization and your shared host. Containers are isolated. They don't have common libs, and they've got much less overhead. And like with Docker, sort of popularized was the ability to port those over and to have consistent runtime. So what does it mean to modernize with Anthos or with open source? And really it begins with Kubernetes, and Kubernetes, particularly Google's Kubernetes, which is GKE, does that orchestration of containers. Once you start running, it's fine to create a couple of containers, but once you start getting hundreds up into the cloud or in your on-prem infrastructure, it becomes very difficult to manage those. And that's where Kubernetes came from. And it really is the de facto standard for organizing and orchestrating your containers. The next piece of the puzzle is a service operator or a service mesh, and that provides your networking functions between these containers. You want to start securing workloads. You want to start having consistent policy for these. And that's where Istio and the service mesh comes in. And then lastly is a serverless sort of developer experience that you get out of things like Knative. The important thing here to consider is that all three of these are open source, and Anthos is introducing 100% software-based solution. So you don't get tied into one vendor's particular cloud. You don't get tied into one vendor's particular hardware. And so at the foundation of Anthos, it's Kubernetes, it's service mesh, an application marketplace, and then a configuration management system. And we'll drill into that quite a bit more. And these are those key components that we'll be discussing. So policy management, operation management, and then the three sort of building block stacks there that we just introduced, which is the GKE, the service mesh, and then lastly your application marketplace on top.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we're talking Google's gold standard in Kubernetes, GKE.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, let's crack into some use cases.
Yep.
So, Troy, tell me a little bit about our friend Con.
Yeah, so Con is head of a development of a new neobank. They've come out recently. They're really cloud native, or they started in the cloud, no on-prem really infrastructure. But what they have a need for is to push new features and code quickly, consistently, and securely. Obviously, being required to be APRA regulated. So one of the things that Con's having issues with is the complexity and the security around managing all of this cloud native infrastructure and containers. And what we're going to talk about today, or show today in this use case, is how Anthos potentially can help provide that single control plane across his Kubernetes infrastructure, and can get his development team doing more development and a lot less infrastructure management.
Focusing on that feature development rather than managing stacks.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, great.
So let's talk a little bit about his problem. So in this case, we saw in the previous video how teams can go that are already cloud native can move to Anthos, which is a centralized control plane risk the security around his Kubernetes infrastructure, as well as just the general management of Kubernetes and services. And so we're moving from that top left quadrant to that right. And we'll be covering these core components, which are service mesh and container management. So the container management, as we said before, was that orchestration layer. And in Google land, it's called GKE, which is Google Kubernetes Engine. And it's that fully managed GKE, best of class, to run Kubernetes at scale, but not have the overheads of upgrades and cluster management. And Google handles all of that for you, as well as the security. And then we'll also be talking about the service mesh. And that service mesh, again, is the services layer or network services layer that handles interactions between containers and workloads and secures them.
And I guess that can get quite complex when you're talking perhaps hundreds or thousands of microservices.
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect.
Okay, so let's see if this demo will work.
Okay, we have sacrificed many a frozen chicken.
That's right.
Yeah.
To the demo gods. That's right. I'll just get that up. So what we're going to be looking at here is the Anthos service mesh. So that's that core part on top of GKE that we're going to be looking at. And in this case, we are running a workload here in our dashboard. This is the Anthos dashboard. So we have two clusters that are connected in. We'll be concentrating to have a lot more. Those are for later demos. But you can see our cluster status here, which is giving us a quick view of just that GKE infrastructure, what it looks like, and then the service mesh is built on top. And we can drill into the service mesh now and have a look at the applications I have running on my service mesh. So we can see all of those here. They currently don't have SLO or SLIs, and I'll talk about those in a second. We want to drill into one of our services here. Let's call it the front end. This is our front end for this particular app, this banking app, for his neobank, for Khan's neobank. And what we want to do is see where that front end service actually sits. So let's go to the topology, and the service mesh provides you that view very quick about your front end service and all the underlying microservices that are also sitting out. And it gives you the dashboard on QPS, the service availability targets that you've set. So we can look at this one and actually go to the service dashboard for any of these services. So once you start running hundreds and even thousands of microservices, it becomes very difficult. So all this dependency mapping is all being done within the service mesh. So I can view now SLO, SLIs.
So can you just define SLO and SLI?
SLI is a service level indicator. So that's something like CPU, or that's something like responses per second. And that is something that could indicate a problem or indicate an issue. And SLO is an objective, or a service level objective. And that is to say, I want 99% availability for my front-end service, let's say. So that's the objective, and you can guarantee that by adding SLIs against that.
Okay, perfect.
So the Anthos Service Mesh allows you to set all of those, and you can hit those through this service dashboard for any of those services, and then roll those up into your overall business service. So we can look at the health. Again, this is and it says we're out of our error budget because we've had 26% over our error budget, which are our target of 99 for a latency. But what we can do is at a service level, which is our front end, we are running across multiple clusters, and so we get a view of the infrastructure regardless of the how many clusters or where that cluster is. We can also look at those connected services, look at the inbound and outbound lines. We can see all those backends that are currently need to be connected. And we can drill into diagnostics, so pulling logs from multiple clusters and have all those together. And we can drill in very quickly and understand what potentially could be a problem with our service.
And obviously, if we're doing this as a developer day in, day out without Anthos, that's a lot of manual work.
That's a lot of manual work
together.
That's a lot of tooling for Khan's dev team that they don't really have time to do or spend. And then you get this sort of mixed mode where you have developers trying to push out features, but then constantly having to fix and debug problems in the infrastructure layer. And that's really where Anthos is looking to help out. So again, doing traffic view, and then there's this security view, which we'll look further. So the service mesh is giving us observability. That's where we're getting all those metrics and pulling out the SLIs and SLOs, the business services. But it'll also do security of the individual services here. So we can see that this that we've got a workload on our front end here, which are two services, mainly online boutique. And what we're going to want to do is change that from plain text, which it says here, and turn that directly into MTLS or secured traffic between services. We can do that easily using Istio. And the difference with Anthos is that is now going to be cross-cluster. So we can run our Istio mesh cross-cluster with Anthos using Anthos Configuration Manager, which we'll drill into a lot more in the next video. But for now, we're just going to secure this by making a change in our Git. And the other thing that Anthos is using is GitOps or Git-based configuration management. And so if we look at our repo here, we can see that there's a bunch of things that are defining what the Anthos clusters will run as. And one of those will be to secure this Istio communication that's happening between the front end and the rest of its services. So all we need to do is, with our GitOps is we make that change. We can have a look. We're changing both our mesh policy here and our destination rule. We're now going to just commit that. I'm going to call it secure TLS front end. And then we push that. And this is going to go up and automatically change our, yeah, there we go. So that's gone up into Git. And now what will happen is Anthos, those Anthos clusters connected will pull in that configuration and make the change automatically to the Kubernetes and Istio stacks that are running underneath those. And so if we wait a few more minutes, this will pull that up and we'll be able to see.
So just while we're waiting for it, maybe we should quickly also talk about that GitOps, managing config as code, because clearly that, that allows for a lot better management of the environment, more consistency in deployments, would you say?
Definitely consistency in deployments across environments as well. So you can have your dev, your test, have those policies and that configuration set for each of those environments, and then manage those all through Git and the Git tooling chain that you're already using, that your developers are already using sort of natively with their application code.
So just thinking back to Con again, our friend Con's now got developers working much more productively on those feature changes.
Correct.
He's getting much more secure development. And I can actually see that's turned green. Very good, Troy. That's good. That one worked out well. Yep.
So that's made that change, and that's now across those clusters, and so that traffic is now been secured, and that's all you really have to do. So to summarize, to solve Con's problem, he can now overlay that security inside his neobank. He's already got his observability through the metrics that we saw that are coming out from his application. And he's reduced his complexity now, so that again, his developers aren't worried about is my observability or why isn't my clusters synchronized in terms of the configuration.
Okay, perfect, very good.
Yeah, so there we go, and that's Anthos Service Mesh and GKE.
All right, use case 2, Troy, with added caffeine and extra zing. Let's talk a little bit about Caroline.
Yeah, so Caroline is a CIO for a large fin services company. And already has quite a bit of on-prem infrastructure and has dipped a toe into cloud a bit. But really, what her strategy is to try and find technology or I guess software which will help her on-prem prepare for the cloud. But because in the past she's had programs to do migrations, they were very costly and not very successful because they were trying to take basically just VMs and sticking them in the cloud, and they find there's a lot of cost involved, security issues with trying to just simply port them over into the on-prem. So she's very interested in how to modernize her applications eventually, but start tackling that by looking at her on-prem first and then migrating workloads to the cloud.
Okay. And so a great example of this is probably let's say someone out there who's got maybe 2.5 years left of investment on their VMware farm.
Yeah.
Getting to the end of that investment and then suddenly trying to dump everything in the cloud's not an ideal strategy, as we kind of discussed in the introduction. And so this gives her a way to actually leverage that same hardware investment, but prepare herself and her team for that kind of journey to the cloud.
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, right. So let's look a little bit more at what we'll be talking about in this demo. Looking back at our quadrant here for moving, what we're talking about is taking that traditional on-prem workload and uplifting it to, or parts of it into containerization, and then having that in place on-prem so that the move to cloud native and to cloud is much easier. So that's really what the quadrant there is showing. And what we'll be talking about in detail is the policy management, which is the Anthos config management. And we'll see in a moment how that sort of ties everything together for both your on-prem and your clusters in the cloud. So policy management is really all defined through Anthos config management, and there's 4 key points that we'll discuss and capabilities we'll discuss for Anthos config management. It's really that multi-cluster, which you get across both your on-prem and multi-cloud. It's also declarative and continuous. So the whole ideal with Kubernetes is that you declare your state. Kubernetes takes that state and then ensures that it's up to date at all time. And that's really where you get the power of Anthos config management. It uses that whole declarative continuous management. Hybrid support as well. So obviously the on-prem Kubernetes clusters and your clusters that are living in GKE or even multi-cloud, we'll see later. And then simple migration. So once you're in that Kubernetes ecosystem, migrating those workloads as well as the policy and configuration is quite easy. So why would you be using Anthos config management when you could just, how is this really a problem? And if you're not around, I guess, a lot of the Kubernetes or those sorts of infrastructures, you maybe not aware of how things can scale in terms of complexity, particularly as you have maybe initially just a single cluster, single configuration. As you start adding more and more workloads, those become much more configuration heavy and problematic to try and keep synchronized, particularly as you move through environments and promote code from staging to prod, etc. So as you start adding teams and more workloads with different teams, and those have different needs and different policies, that just exponentially increases your problem for configuration management. And this is something that Anthos config management will help. So let's jump straight into the demo. And here we can see our Kubernetes clusters. This is in GKE interface in Google Cloud. And what we'll see is we've got two clusters there. First one's called GCP. That's actually running in Google Cloud, and that's a GKE cluster. So that's fully managed by Google, their masters, as well as the nodes for upgrades. And then we also have an on-prem cluster that's been registered into Anthos, and that one is not managed. You can see the type is Kubernetes, and that's running on-prem VMware. And then a Kubernetes cluster on top. And what we'll see with Anthos config management is that we can apply cluster configuration and policy against both of those clusters at the same time using the same centralized configuration resource. So looking at the config repo, so Anthos config manager uses a GitOps model where everything is defined in Git. And Git obviously, for a lot of people understand what Git is and has changed the landscape of declarative infrastructure in using the Git ecosystem. And what we'll see is that that's the same thing that Anthos is using. And this is the configuration that's all defined in cluster resources or cluster registry. And you can see our two clusters here. Central is our GCP and remote is our on-prem. And that defines those two clusters. And then we can have cluster selectors here, which are basically tags or labels that then say what workloads can run where. So we're now extracting that policy from configuration that might live in the cloud or might live on-prem, and it's now centralized in a central configuration repository.
So simple, even I can understand it, Troy.
Well, hopefully, yes.
Yeah. So tell me a bit about this BOA namespace down the bottom here.
So BOA, yeah. So this is our workload, which is Bank of Anthos. Let's have a look at the Bank of Anthos here. This is a banking app that Caroline has running and provides checking account, that sort of history. But what we'll see once we go to workloads in here is this BOA namespace is spread across two different clusters. So we have our front end here, which we just saw. We just ran through. That's a microservice that then goes and talks to ledger writer and log generator, for example. But what you'll see here is that our on-prem for the balance reader, I'll just sort by this, on-prem is the ledger DB, because the APA regulation right now is to leave that on-prem and to run it on-prem. So she has migrated to Kubernetes, but it's not currently running inside a cloud yet. So this is a workload that's spread across both on-prem and into the cloud. And that's a way of her starting to move some of those workloads into cloud and take leverage of cloud, meanwhile still having an on-prem infrastructure that she can uplift. Yeah. So what we'll do now is look at that workload. This is an example of our on-prem here. Not an example. This is running the K9s tool, but this is basically showing all the workloads running. This is the config management system here. And what we can see, this is over in GCP. So this is in Google, and this is an on-prem. And what we'll see is there's some pods here, which are both running this Git importer system and the Git synchronizer. There's actually three components to the Anthos config management. But this syncer will basically take a view of what's happening in that repo, which I just showed, and we'll synchronize that into the cluster to ensure that it's compliant with the policy that's been defined. And that policy then interacts with the BOA or the Bank of Anthos and ensures that only because of the cluster selector, only stuff that's defined to run on-prem or stuff that is allowed to run in cloud will run using those cluster selectors. So now what she wants to do, we'll see as an example, is she is interested in getting a new workload on, and that's going to be a new front-end shop that provides additional services on top of her existing the Bank of Anthos app. So what we'll do is we're going to now, using those cluster selectors, we're going to deploy this new app. To our two clusters. And if we go back over here now, we'll see those starting to get populated.
And I see it's referred to as the hipster app.
This is the hipster app. And that's getting deployed now to both our GCP pod and to our on-prem pod. Yep. And those, again, are ensuring policy through Anthos config management to ensure that only the services that are meant to be over here will be deployed here, and the services meant to be deployed in on-prem, or into the cloud will be deployed into the cloud. So those are coming up and spinning up, and that's great. So that's very similar to the Bank of Anthos, and it's really that easy to ensure policy and then report back, say, to AppRed through the effect of where these workloads are running and the central configuration, which is provides that central policy across those two. Now, keep in mind, these are also not Google, right? So these are, or this on-prem is not Google, but it's because it's Kubernetes, it can be hooked into Anthos and exploit that entire ecosystem. So now she's interested in, she's got this running in both locations, and now she, they've had the hipster shop, and AppRed said, look, the hipster shop's fine to have because it's not actually taking any transaction. All they're doing is, I don't know, using extra points from their bank account or something like that in order to buy stuff. So she's now going to move that into the cloud, and it's just as simple of, again, because it's all centrally managed, deploying that workload and keeping that same policy in place will allow that control, same policies applied here as they're going to get deployed now into the cloud. And so those services which were here are getting now migrated into the cloud, and then this service is getting removed. So you can see how that from central location, Anthos policy management, config management will also apply policy and config control across both of those clusters.
Mm-hmm. So not only has Caroline been able to develop on-prem with the tools that would be associated with cloud, she's also been able to actually apply that policy consistently at scale. Correct. Across both on-premise and in the cloud.
That's right. And so now she has a strategy to apply policy controls through gatekeeper controls, and which we'll cover later in another demo, but apply that configuration and that policy control to ensure that her workloads are secured and prepared for the future to exploit cloud.
Fantastic. Yep. So Troy, use case 3.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about Michael, who looks scarily like Mantle Group's Chief Operating Officer, Michael Bodle.
He does, but Michael is the infrastructure manager at a large bank here in Australia. And is responsible for the cloud platforms. Now, most of the very large FSIs do have a cloud, but AppRed's recent guidance is that you have to remove your dependence on a single vendor. So he needs multi-cloud capabilities to meet that AppRed sort of requirement, as well as remove the single vendor dependence that he has. But he's found often that and has been borne out by a lot of the customers that we talk to, is that it's very complex and can be quite daunting to go for a multi-cloud type of setup. So he's got Kubernetes, he's got cloud native in both, but he's not sure how to apply policy. They have been doing it sort of built into each provider, but that's shown to be costly and not very effective. So he wanted to know how Anthos can potentially help him in securing those workloads.
Okay, let's grab a look at the demo.
Okay. So first we'll do some introductions, a few concepts here. So what we're talking about here is in this demo is taking native cloud stacks, stuff that you may already have in GCP or other stacks, or legacy cloud, VM deployments where you just have VMs. What can you do to then move those into that top right quadrant, which is the cloud native Anthos supporting open standards. So today we'll be talking about both policy management using Anthos Policy Controller and operations management using Stackdriver, and why both of those are important components of Anthos. So first off, just to go and talk a little bit about the Stackdriver. So Stackdriver is the logging and observability tool chain or capability in GCP, and that is going to pull monitoring, stats, logs, all from Kubernetes clusters running in wherever that multi-cloud environment is, and have a consolidated, aggregated place to view all that. So you no longer have to try and tie multiple logging frameworks from the different cloud vendors. You can get that straight out of Kubernetes and put all in the same place. And then Policy Controller we'll drill into a little bit as well. That provides this really strong framework using Open Policy Agent as an intermediary of defining a policy control using something called Rego, and that defines a policy which then gets translated and applied at runtime, as well as in your pipelines for developing and in your delivery of code. And then that gets deployed into GKE or into your on-prem Kubernetes or multi-cloud infrastructure. So let's have a look. So in this case, we've got our GKE instances we've shown here before. Again, these clusters are here, and we've got those under policy management, under Anthos config management. And we've also got a couple other ones in here. We've also got an AWS EKS, which is Elastic Kubernetes Service, I believe, from AWS. And that's running inside AWS, we'll see in a second, and pushing metrics and logs, as well as us having policy enforcement into that cluster. And we've got the same thing here with AKS, which is Azure Kubernetes Service. And both of those are getting pushed into Anthos and registered in Anthos. So let's have a look at that. This is our EKS cluster, DNS demo EKS, what this one's called. Not a whole lot of information on it. I think as far as Kubernetes managed Kubernetes services, AWS is a little bit behind a lot of the others. But you can see that this one is here. And likewise, we've got the Azure one as well. Again, this one's in Australia East. The EKS version here, we've got, where do I have this? US West 2 in Amazon services. So both of those have policy management. So what do those look like in practicality? Let's have a look at that. In our demo here. Sorry. I know what I did. Sorry. Here we go. Sorry. So here we go. We've got our interface for our K9's interface. So this is showing Kubernetes. And again, we've got our two contexts, AKS and EKS. This one, again, as we see, is in West 2, which is the AWS. And the second cluster here we've got over in Australia Southeast. Now, what we'll notice, and we saw in the previous demo, is that this is the config management system. So this is the way of synchronizing that configuration across those clusters. So it's constantly pulling that configuration source, and it's got applied security around Git and that whole Git workflow, which developers ought to be very familiar with. And then the synchronizer service is constantly ensuring that the cluster is up to date, and that includes all of the policy that we'll see in Gatekeeper. And for those that aren't aware what Gatekeeper is a runtime policy engine inside your Kubernetes clusters that ensures that things like workloads that have to be in Australia, for example, can only be placed in that cluster. So in our case, what we've set up here in this Azure cluster is that only workloads that are allowed in Australia are allowed to run on that cluster. And that configuration policy is all done centrally in that Git repo that we saw for Anthos config management.
And so ordinarily, if we think about Michael as the guy running the infrastructure, they would have a different probably set of tools and frameworks in place for the different clouds that they might have.
That's correct. Yeah. So yeah, they'll have to have a whole way of interacting and pulling the information around policy and controlling that policy. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you've got workloads running Kubernetes, you can depend on Kubernetes to simply manage that policy through Open Policy Agent and Gatekeeper service. So it centralizes that. You can go back to Apper and say, we have multi-cloud, and here is the Rego policy, and this is it getting applied to both EKS, AWS, and GKE in GCP.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and this the last thing sort of to show here is our connector. So this GKE connect will log into the Anthos service and show that cluster in the Anthos interface, and that then also provides the Stackdriver, so it configures the logging and observability from both the Istio mesh that you might have running on here and the logging from the Prometheus and metrics coming out of the Kubernetes cluster, pushing those into Stackdriver, and we'll see those here. If we go to our Anthos dashboard, we already saw a bunch of the service mesh previously, but we can look at the cluster and look at those services registered in here. We've got our EKS demo and our Azure demo, and both of those are coming in as external types and registered. Now you have to depend on EKS, and you have to have tooling around EKS or Azure if you have those clusters. But the real power for Anthos is that Anthos can also do GKE for AWS. And that means you're running native GKE type of upgrades and services directly from AWS. So you get even more control and upgrades and managed master nodes and things with that service.